Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm delighted to welcome you here for our special two-day commemoration of the Swiss Reformation. My name is Karine Mogg. I am the director of the Meter Center for Calvin Studies, and it is the Meter Center for Calvin Studies that is hosting and organizing this special commemoration event. We are doing this because we want to shed light on the roots of the Reformation. We want to understand better different parts of the story of the Christian faith. Now, Zwingli and the Swiss Reformation is much less well known than Luther or Calvin. You remember the Luther anniversary in 2017 was a big deal. And Calvin's birthday in 2009, that was a pretty big deal too. The Swiss Reformation and Zwingli does not get a lot of airtime. So we thought we need to do something to make sure that this part of the story of the Reformed history is also better known. I'm offering you welcome on behalf of the Meter Center for Calvin Studies, but also on behalf of Calvin Theological Seminary, the building in which we are. President Jules Maidenblick is sending his greetings. He is currently at Haupt College. Haupt College is inaugurating their new president today. And of course, that means that all the other presidents go out and go in their robes and look very fine and splendid. So he's doing that. He hopes to be back with us by tonight and certainly for the session tomorrow morning. But greetings from him as well. I also want to thank the co-sponsors of this conference. There are many different organizations that are helping us fund this two-day event. The Meter Center, the Heritage Fund of the Calvin Theological Seminary, Kuiper Institute for Global Faculty Engagement, the Acton Institute, and the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. And we are deeply grateful to all of them. A few practical notes. The plenary sessions will be interspersed by 15-minute breaks. It's a good time to stretch your legs, find the restrooms. There'll be refreshments out in the lobby. You know this is a conference on the Swiss Reformation. And you know the Swiss are known for punctuality, okay? So 15 minutes does mean 15 minutes. We are coming back and starting up again after 15 minutes, okay? I want to highlight the book tables. We are delighted to have Baker Bookhouse with 2 tables of books out there. Steve Ayers from Baker tells me he has enough books for everyone here to have at least one. They are at 40% discount from the list price. This is a good deal. So peruse the book tables, see if there's a book you're interested in, and buy one. It's a big help. The Acton Institute also has a book table. Feel free to browse and look at those as well. One key announcement, this is a schedule change for today. Our second speaker, Amy Burnett, is not yet here. She is in Chicago. She is waiting for her plane. So we have switched the order of presentations. Esther Chung Kim, who is due to speak tomorrow, is now speaking this afternoon, and Amy will speak tomorrow morning instead. So swap those 2 presentations over. This is a 2-day conference, so we meet this afternoon in here. This evening, there's a special presentation in the chapel, and then tomorrow morning in here once more. And we will be done by lunchtime, 12, 12:15, something like that. So you have the rest of Saturday clear to do other things. There is a buffet supper tonight in the Student Center for those who have pre-registered. If you pre-registered and said you were coming to the supper, everything is good. Go over to the Student Center. You will have your buffet supper there. At 7:15 p.m. in the chapel, we will begin our reenactment. So we have a Reader's Theater reenactment for you tonight. We are reenacting the 1523 debate that took place in Zurich, which was a very significant event. It was one of the earliest debates on religious matters that took place in front of government leaders, not church councils. And it took place in the vernacular, not in Latin. Makes it very significant. Now tonight we're doing this in English. This is good, okay? And it's a Reader's Theater so we're not memorizing our lines, but we're going to be performing it for you. I have 14 different people participating, plus some city councilors in splendid robes and beautiful hats. There will be drama, there will be music. It was not to be missed. Okay, so find your way to the chapel for this 7:15 tonight. One special welcome. We are delighted to have with us Mr. Walter Wegmüller, who is the Honorary Consul of Switzerland in Detroit. Please, would you stand for us? Thank you very much. We are delighted to have representation from Switzerland for an event about Switzerland. That is very splendid. We welcome him and Mrs. Doris Wegmüller to our Calvin's campus. We hope you enjoy this gathering very much. In a moment, I will introduce our first speaker, but first, let us join together in prayer. O Lord our God, we thank you for bringing us together today, for giving us opportunities to learn from one another, to discuss, to get more insights about important parts of our history. And now, Lord, as we learn together, open our minds, give us insights, and help us in our conversations to learn and grow together. And we do all this to your glory. In the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, our first speaker today is Professor Bruce Gordon. He is the Titus Street Professor of Ecclesiastical History at Yale Divinity School. He obtained his PhD from the University of St. Andrews. In fact, that's when I first met Bruce, was back in St. Andrews. I was doing my master's degree, and he was completing his PhD studies. He obtained his PhD at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where he taught modern history and served as Deputy Director of the St. Andrews Reformation Studies Institute before he joined the faculty at Yale. He is the author of several major works, including The Swiss Reformation, published by Manchester University Press in 2002, and his biography of Calvin, published by Yale University Press in 2009. In 2012, he received an honorary doctorate from the University of Zurich, and I've just learned he has also received an honorary doctorate from the University of Dalhousie, where he did his undergraduate degree. His most recent book, John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, a Biography, was published by Princeton University Press. His forthcoming monograph is titled God's Armed Prophet, Huldrych Zwingli and the Early Reformation. It will be hopefully published by Yale University Press. His presentation for us today is titled Remembering Zwingli in 2019, Current Debates About His Legacy. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Gordon.
Thank you, Karin. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's, for me, a particular pleasure because I've never actually been to Calvin before, and I've never been to Grand Rapids, although Grand Rapids has always played an enormous role in my interests over the years. I'm very grateful to the Meter Center for the invitation, and indeed, as Karin has just said, our paths crossed a very long time ago in St. Andrews, and it has been a great pleasure over the years for both my wife Rona and I to know Karin and Chris as friends as well as colleagues in the Reformation world. What I want to talk about today, what I want to talk about today is, in a way, memory, and really asks the question, how do we, in 2019, think about a character who lived 500 years ago. What do we make of the Reformation? And when I first proposed this paper, I thought, well, I'll talk mostly specifically about the ways in which that's done in current media, and I am going to do that. I'm going to talk about a big-budget film that was made about Zwingli. But what became very clear to me very early on is that the way people are talking about Zwingli in 2019 has very strong echoes of the way he was talked about even at Joel, well, just after he died. The ambiguities of this character, the way in which he could be seen in very different lights, is something that has emerged again in 2019, but it has a very long history. 2019 marks the 500th anniversary of Huldrych Zwingli's arrival in Zurich as a priest in the major church, the Grossmünster. He was elected in a divided vote, a controversial figure whose reputation for sexual promiscuity and outspoken views on sensitive subjects such as mercenary service and alliance with the King of France. Many from Zurich had heard him preach at the Benedictine Abbey at Einsiedeln, where an annual pilgrimage from the city went to the Black Madonna. Zwingli's role had been to preach to those pilgrims. The disagreement amongst the canons of the Grossmünster in December 1518 was a harbinger of what was to follow. Zwingli divided the city, his native land, and the Reformation itself, with his uncompromising views on the nature of God's Word. In 2019, we struggle to know what to make of this prophet who died in a nocturnal skirmish, dressed in armor and wielding a halberd. My intention today is to talk about some of the current debates about Zwingli as a figure, including, as I say, a big-budget biopic, which was released earlier this year. But to get to our time, we need to reflect on the various ways in which the Reformer has been remembered, commemorated, and even vilified from the time of his death through the 19th century to our own time. Like most significant figures, there was never one Huldrych Zwingli. When he died in the night of 11th October 1531, his closest friends, although devastated, were not exactly certain what to make of what had happened. Who was this extraordinarily charismatic figure, this lover of music, of good humor, who had twice ridden out with soldiers of Zurich into military or towards military conflict? Zwingli had caused a disastrous war that had humbled Zurich and nearly wrecked the Reformation. Had he, as a radical and Catholic opponent maintained, as his radical and Catholic opponents maintained, compromised the faith through an attachment to civil authority? The answers were by no means straightforward, even for among those who were his closest friends. At the end of his life, Zwingli's closest companion, Leo Jud, confessed on his deathbed, quote, "Protect yourselves from war. Do not be driven by lust for war. Work for the maintenance of peace. It is fitting for Christians, and above all shepherds, to show humility, not thirst for revenge. Regrettably, I rode to war in time of great evil. Therefore I cry out to God that he might have mercy on me and forgive me. Remember forever the unfortunate consequences of this war." The war, of course, was the Second Battle of Kappel. And in the weeks following that battle, Johannes Ecolampadius, who himself only had a short time to live, wrote to Martin Frecht in the city of Ulm, "Dearest brother, I cannot hide from you the pain that has overcome me, that our fellow Zwingli has died at the hands of dreadful enemies, and in their fury they tore him apart. Thus I know well how the spread of this news through the world will redound with wild, rollicking joy that will scandalize." Ecolampadius defended his friend, arguing that Zwingli believed he must stand amongst his people and not cower behind the walls of the city. Nevertheless, he had reservations. "Relying on our friendship," he wrote, "I repeatedly appealed to him not to engage in the things that have little to do with the gospel. He wrote back that the morals of his people were little known to me. He had seen the sword drawn and would do the duty of a true shepherd. He would not act rashly. There were others. Ambrosius Blarer, the reformer in Constance, wrote to Martin Bucer in Strasbourg expressing his shock. But he also wondered whether the cause had been just. It has always worried me, he writes, I say freely and filled me with concern that this man with his irrepressible attitudes, unbidden, ever more armed for war. Yet, however, I remained silent, as I thought it was through some unfathomable decree of God that Zwingli, with words and weapons, proclaimed Christ. Martin Bucer, who was not all that close to Zwingli and whose relationship with the reformer was not untroubled, put the case most clearly. I feared for Zwingli. The gospel triumphs through the cross. One deceives oneself when one expects salvation of Israel through external means, with impetuosity and triumph through weapons. I fear, however, that this matter has begun without the will of God, and it greatly unsettles me that our Zwingli not only recommended the war, but did so incorrectly, as it appears to be the case, and if we are rightly informed. Martin Luther was having none of this, and in his table talk he responded to a question as to whether Zwingli had been saved. I wish from my heart Zwingli could be saved, but I fear the contrary. For Christ has says that those who deny him shall be damned. God's judgment is sure and certain, and we may safely pronounce it against the ungodly, unless God reserve unto himself a particular privilege and dispensation. Unlike the memorials to Luther, which began with his death in 1546, the case with Zwingli was strikingly different. There was no official funeral in Zurich or public event. There was no grave. The young Heinrich Bullinger in 1532 held a public speech on the topic of the prophetic office in which he dared to name Zwingli, whose name was so controversial in the city. He named him as a true prophet. It was a brave decision given that the dead reformer was widely reviled in his adopted city for having brought this war. Throughout the 16th century, attempts to honor Zwingli remained deeply complicated. In the 1540s, during the height of the sacramental disputes with the Lutherans, Bullinger and his colleagues decided to produce a Latin edition of Zwingli's writings. Just over 20 years after his death, the St. Gall humanist and politician and friend of the reformer, Joachim von Watt, better known as Vadian, wrote to Heinrich Bullinger in Zurich and succinctly addressed the problem of Zwingli's legacy in the Reformation. Bullinger's hope was that Vadian would provide a biography of Zwingli for this edition. Vadian wrote back saying, "It is not politic, it is not prudent at this time to produce a biography in Latin in the public sphere of Zwingli." The edition was produced in 1545, but with no vita. Writing the life of Zwingli in the 16th century was an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. John Calvin avoided speaking about Zwingli as much as possible, and when he did, it was rarely positive. But we do find fulsome praise from Geneva in the Icones of Theodor Beza, Calvin's friend and successor. The Icones were a tribute to the leaders of the Reformation, pairing portraits with encomia. Zwingli is paired with Ecolampadius. Beza describes the two men as Christi fortissimus atletas, who excelled in doctrine and who were, quote, by far the best of the Alpine peoples. Of Zwingli's death, there were words of praise. And in the war, he wrote, stirred up by those who could not bear the brilliance of the gospel, a hostile hand forced Zwingli's fall while he was serving in the army for his own ministry, such that God crowned the death of his servant with a double honor. For what could be more holy or honorable than to die both for the glory of God and for the patria? If we move to the 19th century, Zwingli became prominent in both public cultures of memorialization and in the increasing flow of literature about the Reformation. In the Swiss context, several principal themes emerged: as liberal theologian, as patriot, and as hero. In the liberal theological context of the 19th century, Zwingli's theology was largely admired for its emphasis on the return to the gospel, social renewal, and moral rectitude of the Christian life. As with Calvin, key aspects of Zwingli's theology were passed over in silence, such as his strong emphasis on the doctrine of election, in favor of Zwingli as the regenerator of Christian society and ethics. Following the Congress of Vienna and the founding of modern Switzerland, Zwingli became a model for the hopes of a nation, the aspiration found not only in churches and theological faculties, but in wider society through journalism, the arts, and culture. In 1819, the first major anniversary of the century, the role of the Enlightenment and Reformed Protestantism was deeply felt. In the Zurich Church, the role of reason and reasonable Christianity prevailed, and there was strong opposition between those who espoused this reasonable Enlightenment Christianity and the more strong pietistical elements that sought the end of the state church. The Zwingli of 1819 official celebrations was a rational humanist, a moderate, a man of church and state existing in harmony. Following the formation of the United Church in Brandenburg, there was also hope that his rational theology offered a way towards agreement with the Lutherans. It was to this end that a central narrative arose of the comparison of Zwingli and Luther, and it worked in several ways. Amongst moderates and liberals, every effort was made to demonstrate the harmony between them and move beyond unfortunate historical circumstances and personal antagonisms. They were both great figures of the church, both mighty reformers. One example, the learned pastor and author Heinrich Wilhelm Rotermund in Bremen, a Lutheran much admired for his scholarship, expressed the hopeful views of a generation in a biography which he prefaced with the observation that most studies of Zwingli concentrated on his theology and not on his character, which he would endeavor to do. Further, Rotermund expressed his desire to move beyond the partisan debates within Protestantism to present a balanced account, free from confessional prejudices. Far too long, he wrote, Zwingli and Luther have been considered only in their differences. He writes, in learnedness and acumen and the skill to develop and defend their teachers, the two men rather remained an equal of each other, but also as almost even more the equal of each other in that neither of them would surrender even the smallest part of the truth that they believed they had discovered. So they separated themselves in the flames of conflict further from one another than was necessary or salutary. Their contemporaries, mainly their supporters, objected much at that, but posterity does them all the more justice. It honors them both in gratitude, even in the midst of their mistakes and passions. Amongst those who promoted a more favorable view of the relationship between the reformers, there was a consensus. Luther was the greater figure, the true founder of the Reformation. But Zwingli was likewise to be honored. They had both sought the truth, and their theological differences were not as dramatic as often portrayed. Much of the differences were cultural and temperamental. Luther, the profound monk and mystic, while Zwingli was the more sanguine peasant and child of the Alps. Their paths to the truth had been different, leading them to diverse visions of the Christian life. Luther was the man of the inner soul, while Zwingli looked to the reform of the community and of fatherland. While many Lutherans were not prepared to accept this optimistic account, Catholic writers of the age took the greatest pleasure in casting Zwingli as a lesser version of the heretic Luther. The major question remained Zwingli's death. Once more, the question was whether he had died valorously, righteously, or in violent delusion. The prevailing narratives of Swiss patriots were that he had died a martyr to religious freedom, democracy, and independence, all themes of the 19th century. There were attempts to see past him as merely a Protestant, to make his loyalty to the Swiss Confederation a symbol for all confessions in the 19th century. The literature produced in this period was legion, and I offer just a couple of examples. One taken from a gathering of students at the field of Kappel to celebrate their Glaubensheld. We gather, they wrote, at the place, in one speaker stated, we gather at the place where Zwingli fell, not in order that we might offer to him with fleeting emotion due payment of our gratitude, our admiration, our love, even if it would be from still so sincere hearts, but also, as it were, to invoke his heroic spirit, in order that he might speak to us like an immortal to another person, like an angel from beyond to a brother from this world, that he might consecrate us as warriors of the same battle. You can see the way they've embraced this aspect of him. And also what was his and still is. Another speech at the same event. Why is his death, which was so longed for by his enemies, deliberately celebrated? Is it not precisely so with the commemoration of the death of Christ? Another parallel. But just as there is a Savior of the world who himself decreed such commemoration of his work, overcoming death, arose again, so too he rose again, the purifier of his teaching, in friends who in part multiplied, maintained it in his spirit, and even up to our generation, passed on their blessing to the next generations. And the commemoration of the moment of light, the death of the best of this earth, is it not the most effective means of keeping their work alive for posterity? By the middle century, the Swiss churches were locked in an internecine battle over theological direction of the church. One of the focal points was the creed and whether it should be used or recited at baptisms. But that was only the beginning of the troubles for a church where a referendum had overwhelmingly supported a new constitution, one which brought into question the traditional relationship between church and state. There was considerable appeal for a separation of the two and the creation of an independent church. Georg Finzler, although representing the moderates, was a firm proponent of preserving the free church, the state church, and was successfully able to steer through the tumult and retain the established order. When Finzler became chief pastor in the Grossmünster in 1871, he began a campaign to have a Zwingli monument erected in the city. The idea was highly controversial and stirred considerable opposition, not least because of the controversial reputation of the reformer and his close association with the state church. Finzler was clear in articulating his purpose. We certainly want to erect a monument to honor Zwingli, but not in any manner to idolize him, but rather to express our gratitude and joy for which God gave in this man. We shall not refrain from following the sensibilities of our time and erect a visible monument to Zwingli, as Basel has done for its Ecolampadius. There are two aspects of this story I want to touch on very briefly. First is the image itself. Numerous drafts were prepared for what the memorial should look like. And here we have, I don't know if you can see it from here, I'm standing in your way, but this is when the monument was actually commissioned in 1885. But the debate over it was extremely fierce. The major controversy was around the extremely large sword. You may have seen it, the extremely large sword, which was regarded as a monument to his bellicose spirit and death on the battlefield. But Christian Moser has suggested a more persuasive argument, mainly that the creator, who was himself, curiously, a Catholic of this monument, was actually looking to another example, one that was in the city of Munich where he studied, and that is, if I can do this, I just did something I shouldn't have done. That is the Albrecht Dürer's Four Holy Men, where you have the figure of Paul holding the sword. The idea was that actually Zwingli was not the man of war, but the man of Paul. The other aspect of the monument lay in Finzler's intention. He believed that Zwingli could be a figure of reconciliation in the theological war between church parties. Each person, he claimed, had their own Zwingli, the liberals, the conservatives, the free church, and the state church. The drive for a commemoration went hand in hand with attempts to solve the splintering of the Reformed churches amongst the Swiss. By the end of the century, however, Finzler had stated, "Personally, Zwingli will remain a model of a robust faith and trust in God in a troubled age. With Zwingli, we do not want a church that is narrow religious circle, but one which stands in the middle of the people and works with them. It serves its morals and social problems. A church that shares its joys and its sorrows. Indeed, out of the gospel it exercises for the whole population a practicing sanctifying and consecrating influence." This, Finzler claimed, is what Zwingli desired. Zwingli had a long and difficult relationship with contemporary Zurich and Swiss society. And what I want to do is to pass over briefly some of the great voices of the 20th century, by which we would need to look at Karl Barth, Walter Köhler, Oskar Fahner, and the great Gottfried Locher, to convey some of the manner in which our struggles to understand and make sense of the Reformer belongs to this long tradition of multiple interpretations. What has fascinated me over the course of the 2017 and in this year 2019 Reformation anniversaries of how they have played out in what we now have as largely secular societies, both in Europe and North America. I have followed the debates in Zurich and in Switzerland as they attempt to come to terms with the most significant religious figure in their history and the most controversial. In 2003, a special edition of the Swiss cultural magazine Du, that was largely dedicated to discussing Zwingli, the author, Lukas Berfusser, a distinguished Swiss writer, wrote, as someone who had grown up in the Protestant church, "The Zurich in which I live is no longer Zwingli's Zurich. Life in my neighborhood is colorful and wild, by no means Protestant. Here one finds more confessions than I could have imagined in my childhood, and few of them are Christian. There are Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Christians, and Buddhists. There are heathens and tribalists. The shades run from the ultra-Orthodox to extreme liberals. My quarter is close to an ideal in which each has their own religion and possesses their own book. And in each book there is at least one prayer for the poor Zwingli and his dreadful fate on some field in the Zurich hinterland." More recently, the book to accompany an exhibition in Zurich called Shadows of the Reformation, the politician Markus Noter, once responsible for church-state relations, offered a contribution in an article called "Nobody Wants to Return to Zwingli." Zwingli stands for the hatred of enjoyment, music, theater, images, and entertainment. He stands for moral mandates, prescriptions, early curfews, even earlier starting of the workday, fewer breaks, strong work ethic, elderberry juice, providing tea, decaffeinated coffee, non-alcoholic beer, and vegan bratwurst. Much in contemporary Scotland, where Calvinism, as much as it is the nation's heritage, is widely regarded by many as what's wrong with the country, liberal Zurich has come to regard its reformer as the founder of what it calls Puritanism. In 2015, in an interview with the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, Christoph Ziegrist, pastor of the Grossmünster, addressed the question of decline in church attendance and the negative image of Zwingli. He was later given this reputation, and one can hardly restore him. Zwingli, Ziegrist said, was no Zwinglian. He loved life and music. He could sing very well and play numerous instruments, among which was the hammer dulcimer. He was a Toggenburger person. Robust defense of Zwingli, however, Ziegrist admitted that there was something known as Zwinglianism. and that, in the popular imagination, was not good. Zurich tourism, attempting to find a more upbeat way of presenting the Reformation to tourists, asked the question, affluent Switzerland due to the Reformation? Among his numerous achievements, it continued, Zwingli had brought a new attitude. At first sight, these moral restrictions that he imposed were very strict and disagreeable. But at the same time, these rules and regulations laid the foundation for the affluent Switzerland that we know today. Zwingli advocated a new work ethic, diligence, discipline, thrift, and frugality, and introduced a social welfare system to look after the poorest and most disadvantaged. And while subsequently the first factories, new commercial enterprises, and international trade established themselves in Protestant areas, the Catholic cantons continued to be characterized by impoverished farming communities, which had to give their already meager income to the all more ostentatious Catholic churches. For the most part, the marking of the Zwingli anniversary in his adopted city has been a fascinating mixture of irony and historical reckoning. Thomas Meissen, the Swiss historian who is professor of early modern history in Heidelberg and currently director of the German Historical Institute in Paris, has robustly argued that Zwingli was the most significant figure in Swiss history. Further, that his Reformation was the most important Swiss contribution to world history. Meissen is no stranger to controversy. In 2015, for the 500th commemoration of the Battle of Marignano, in which French troops triumphed over the Swiss in the Italian wars, Meissen took on one of the sacred cows of his national identity. The defeat at Marignano, it has long been argued, was a beginning point of Swiss neutrality. Meissen's careful rejection of this historical myth led to a prominent battle in the media between conservatives and liberals about the identity of their land. In an online review with a reformed media, Meissen was clear that Zwingli is the most important contribution to the Swiss in world history. He was a humanist thinker. He had a religious vision, a conviction for which he was prepared to die. No other reformer died on the battlefield. The other reformers worked in their church rooms. The Swiss Reformation came from Zurich and later became successful worldwide as an export through Calvin's Geneva. Without doubt, the most significant development in the 2019 anniversary of the Swiss Reformation has been Stefan Haupt's film, Zwingli, the biggest budget film ever made in Switzerland. It will be released on DVD in October. Starring Maximilian Simonischek as the eponymous reformer and Sarah Sophia Meyer as Anna Reinhart, the film was a commercial success across the country, raising questions about religion and identity. The director, Haupt, grew up in a Free Church Methodist family, and he knew Zwingli well from childhood stories. They would visit the reformer's house in Wildhaus, and his mother came from the region of St. Gall. In interviews, Haupt made it clear that he is no longer an observant Christian. He left the church at 20. But that he has enormous sympathy for the role of religion in society. Like any film, Haupt made clear distinctions about what to include and what to leave out. Most striking for us are how two of the most prominent moments in the reformer's life are not present on the screen. The meeting with Luther at Marburg in 1529 and his death in 1531. There is no battle scene to conclude the story. This is not the Zwingli Haupt seeks to present. He was fully aware of the reformer's continuing reputation for moral totalitarianism. At the heart of the film, however, is the complexity of the man, his contradictions and competing and conflicting impulses. Haupt's Zwingli raises a lot of questions, but he is certainly no cardboard figure. The way in which Haupt finds his approach is largely creative. He gives voice to Anna Reinhart, Zwingli's life, about whom we know very little. There is only one letter from the reformer to his beloved Anna, and it says very little about their relationship. Anna was a widow with children who lived next door to Zwingli and nursed him through the plague in 1519. By 1522, early in the year, they had secretly married. 2 years later, they kept this very badly concealed secret and made it official. Anna is in many ways in the film our eyes to Zwingli. She hears him preaching and is deeply moved by his passion. But she is also afraid of his radicalism. Like most people, she has no idea where the movement is going, and she can hardly imagine the faith to which she has been so devoted is being entirely turned on its head. Haupt puts a lot of time into portraying their domestic scenes, but yet without sensationalism. Anna allows us to see what Zwingli's friends wrote about. He was a man of humor, loved his children, and took great pleasure in music and singing. As we have already heard, in Haupt, Zwingli was not a Zwinglian. And what I'd like to do is to show you just a bit, all that I could get was available, which is the trailer.
Es war eine düstere Zeit, geprägt von religiösem Fanatismus und Gewalt. Höchste Zeit für eine Reformation von der Kirche und der Gesellschaft.
Christ sein heisst nicht von Christus schwätzen, sondern ein Leben zu führen, wie Christus geführt hat.
Meine Zeit.
As you've seen from this short clip, the film goes to extraordinary lengths to convey historical accuracy. The visuals are stunning, the costumes striking, and the dialogue, as you can see it was made in Swiss German, remarkably authentic. As Haupt said, they had to essentially create a language to convey the 16th century discourse for modern audiences. The violence of the age is stressed. Anabaptists are drowned, and Jakob Kaiser, the Reformed preacher, is gruesomely put to death at the stake. Haupt was clear that he did not wish to whitewash or make Zwingli a hero. The complexities of dealing with the radicals is seen through the events of iconoclasm and the drowning of Felix Manz in 1527. The Zwingli story has little place for women, so Haupt gives a central role to the abbess of the Frau Münster. Catholics, however, come off very badly in the film. Leading members of the ecclesiastical hierarchy come across as unsympathetic and often gluttonous. You may have seen them eating and drinking in that short clip. There is no effort to understand the perspectives of Bishop Hugo von Hohenlandenberg or Johann Fabri, who debated with Zwingli in 1523, who I assume we're going to hear this evening. Following from the theme of prison-like perspectives of Zwingli, how then should he appear in this film? How does a major film company in a highly secular land where church attendance is plummeting make sense of a powerful and uncompromising prophet of the Christian faith? Although we do not find much theology in the film, Haupt makes it clear that religious ideas and convictions are at the heart of the story. There is no attempt to explain election or the Lord's Supper. Rather, Haupt presents Zwingli as a person of extraordinary character and resolve. What Zwingli, and particularly Haupt Zwingli, does is put forward the need to stimulate the mind of the faithful so that the true essence of sacred texts can penetrate social systems, freeing it from corruption. Intelligence, in short, is the key to freeing oneself from the yoke of dangerous religious and political dogmas. What comes across powerfully is Haupt's engagement with Zwingli's conception of Christian freedom. He works with it to argue that personal, thoughtful engagement is the most potent force against ignorance and oppression or false religion. He finds in Zwingli, in a line with earlier generations, a more liberal, reasonable voice for a more self-reflected form of faith. Haupt is picking up on a long lineage of Zwingli interpretation that we find strikingly, for example, in the Swiss-American historian Philipp Schaff. The film concentrates largely on the early Zwingli, directly after his arrival. And I can just show you a few more pictures. There's Anna Reinhart there. Zwingli is a whistleblower. He speaks to a modern generation alienated from contemporary politics. The Bible is the source of these powerful convictions, but those principles come across in the film as strikingly modern. This is further developed in the scene that is historically inaccurate, an accusation that one can only rarely make against this film. At one point, Zwingli is seen as sanctioning the translation of the Quran, something that he never did or ever talked about. But it contributes to this notion that he is a figure of religious tolerance, and again, an idea that has a long lineage in interpretation. When asked about how he tried to present Zwingli afresh, Haupt says, "Sure, not to forget the great impact that Zwingli once again has today. When the politicians demand that the church should intervene less in political affairs, we have to return to Zwingli. He involved himself fully in politics and was the spiritual director of the Zurich Council. Zwingli," Haupt says, "understood Christianity as a compass for political matters, which, for example, is exemplified most clearly in our decision not to send weapons into lands with civil wars." Not all were impressed. There were many critics of the film, largely people who thought it was too committed to historical accuracy and that they actually forgot a plot. But those criticisms, I think, are largely deflected by the extraordinary way in which the story is told. So how can we, to conclude, think a little bit about Zwingli? And here I'm going to touch on my own thoughts in having more or less finished a biography. Huldrych Zwingli possessed the qualities of those remarkable religious figures who in their person draw together unresolved contradictions and prove to be their making, and as well, in Zwingli's case, their downfall. To say that Zwingli was complex is alone banal. What I try to do is explore the ways in which competing impulses and colliding tensions proved remarkably generative, fecund, and destructive. Martin Luther gave voice to the Protestant creed of Scripture, faith, and grace alone. Zwingli's debt to the Wittenberg reformer was deep, as he acknowledged in his more generous moments. But his path diverged and his vision strikingly different. The reformer of Zurich created a Christian world that in many respects had never existed before. He envisaged a new form of church, sacraments, and sacral community. That vision would ultimately become the Reformed tradition, and more broadly known as forms of Calvinism. And its theology and forms of church would find a multitude of different expressions. But the origins lay in the aspirations of a peasant son from Toggenburg. Zwingli believed that the world could be transformed. Christ was coming, but the judgment of God was upon the earth now, demanding human righteousness. Jerusalem, the golden, would have to wait for the apocalypse, but its purity and order was the hope for the fetid communities of the 16th century. He was not alone in this expectation, but perhaps its most profound exponent. To reach Zwingli in a distant age, we must begin with his God. If we were to seek a common thread through his life as priest and reformer, we would find it in a vision of God as creator, omnipotent, and good. Indeed, God is goodness itself. That God can be inscrutable, his decisions unfathomable, and certainly beyond human comprehension. But without doubt, he loved humanity. Zwingli had influential teachers on this point. His beloved Plato spoke of the source of all things in the good, and his mentor Erasmus taught the optimism of creation. The Christian life for Zwingli was not a dull, self-flagellating trudge through this world. Yes, God sent hardships to test the faithful and discipline, but Zwingli rejoiced in describing life as a joy. God was to be enjoyed, and the faithful to live in a posture of gratitude and service. Lives were constantly transformed and transforming, making the world more just. The focal point of this transformed life was the Eucharist. Zwingli's notorious belief that the Lord's Supper was an act of memory or commemoration was primarily intended as an expression of glory and unity. In the light pouring through the clear glass, reflecting on the whitewashed walls, one, for Zwingli, encountered a vision of eternity. Unity beyond time with the gathering of the faithful, past, present, and future. Yet there was a serpent in the garden. Zwingli sought to bring together temporal and spiritual authority such that they seamlessly formed the body of Christ in the world. To do this, however, he harnessed power and violence to magistrates and church. Individuals and communities were constantly in a state of becoming, of striving to be more Christ-like. But words, sacraments, and prayers were not enough. The rod of governance was not only to correct, when necessary, the governing powers had to demonize, exclude, and destroy. Like Luther, quickly Zwingli discovered the dispiriting reality that most people would not readily convert to the gospel. The forces of the opposition to the Reformation in Zurich and his plans for evangelizing the Swiss Confederation took the form of reluctant peasants, the institutional church, and hostile political authorities. The gospel, he believed, was not to be thwarted, and every power, spiritual and temporal, was to be conscripted. Zwingli, the prophet of the renewed body of Christ, was also the tactician who drew up military plans for the conquest of Catholic neighbors. Naturally, he did not want war, but he never doubted the justice of breaking resistance to the word of God. That was his understanding of Reformation. God had entered into human history to rescue a lost people by renewing his word. Like Luther, Zwingli did not see that intervention as bringing peace, but conflict with the forces of Satan. Unlike Luther, however, the Swiss saw Christians as recruited into that fight. All recalcitrance was to be overcome. Zwingli, to conclude, presents a distinctive set of problems for thinking about the Reformation, just as Luther does with his view of Jews and the problematic and continued to be debated case of Michael Servetus. Zwingli inherited from medieval Christianity a powerful sense of orthodoxy and the utter intolerance of heresy. However, there was a nuance. He rejected the Jews as benighted deniers of Christ, yet he found a model for Christian ministry in the rabbinic tradition of education and service of the word. He had an expansive view of salvation, expecting to find the virtuous figures of classical antiquity in heaven. Yet he rejected those who denied infant baptism and were drowned in the Limmat River. If I can conclude with one appeal, it is to take what Gottfried Locher demanded over 50 years ago. Let us take this complicated person on his own terms. He was far more than just Luther's opponent or Calvin's predecessor. He was an extraordinarily creative, challenging person who embodied many of the contrary impulses of his age. And if, however, we struggle over the next couple of days to catch his spirit, all I can say is that we're in very good company with his friends. Thank you.
Well, Bruce, thank you so much. That was a really stimulating start. We're going to have some time for questions here, and if possible, I'd like to maybe lead off. So, it was fascinating for me to learn more about how Zwingli was perceived in Switzerland. Mm-hmm. What is really interesting is that in the English-speaking world, he's largely invisible. Mm-hmm. And I can think of some reasons why that would be so, but perhaps you've got some insights to share as to why we've got Luther, we've got Calvin, and then Zwingli is sort of, we don't know anything about him.
Yeah. In the 19th century, with the revival of writing on the Reformation, particularly biographies and histories, there actually was a very robust market for Zwingli biographies in English. I talked about this when we had our conference in Zurich. There's an extraordinary number of biographies, and he's considered one of the canonical figures of the Reformation. Mm-hmm. But there are problems. For instance, just to take one example, in the American world, Zwingli as the clearest exponent, even more so than Calvin, of this tight, often what's referred to as theocracy. Mm-hmm. It's I think an incorrect term, but frequently used. Theocracy. Many of the American biographies and church histories find that in him very difficult.
Right.
And there's a sense that Calvin comes with a more nuanced interpretation of the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. There's a kind of supersessionism in the sense, a strong one, that Calvin took what was best of Zwingli and moved it.
Yeah.
So therefore, it's less imperative for us to know about this first character. What I'm really interested in, as I said at the end here, is I think his story is extraordinarily interesting on its own terms, not least of which because I think it's a mirror on the earliest years of the Reformation.
Absolutely.
I mean, Calvin is the next generation, and he inherits much of what has already happened. But the way history has seen it has not been that way. We've taken the figure of Calvin and, for the most part, left behind. But it's also, of course, Geneva's extraordinary importance in the 16th century. Bullinger in Zurich is one of the great fathers of the Reformation. And certainly many exiles go to Zurich, as you know perfectly well, and many students, as you know perfectly well. But the importance of Geneva and France creates a platform that can't be matched by. So I think there's a whole range of things. But he also gets tied up in the 19th century, and it's very interesting how 19th century views of Zwingli continue to influence very heavily 20th century. They were proved extraordinarily enduring. So this idea that Zwingli was a sort of more liberal theologian, that because he had what was taken to be a more liberal interpretation of the doctrine of election, and a whole range of other things. So I think there's a number of reasons why he was a lesser figure, but I think the major reason is because of the emphasis on Calvin. Calvin was a figure with whom people more readily could see their connection.
Connected. Exactly. Thank you. That's very helpful. Right. Other questions. So we have another microphone over there. When you ask your questions, if you could say your name, and then also if you could make sure to hold the microphone kind of high up on the microphone, then everybody can hear okay. So, questions, comments, things you want to ask.
I'm interested to hear more about the people who start to bring the memory of Zwingli forward, and who were they? Because I don't know a lot about Arminius, but the Arminians that followed Arminius have a different take on what they thought Arminius really wanted, and even the personality and character of the movement becomes different.
Yes.
Than Arminius himself was.
Yes.
And so, who is it that picks up this memory of Zwingli? Who were these people? What was their temperament?
Do you mean, first of all, in the kind of generation right after him?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Who carries it forward so he doesn't get completely lost?
Yeah.
But then you get this new wave that's in the 18th century.
This, the major figure in trying to keep alive Zwingli's reputation in the 16th century is Heinrich Bullinger. Heinrich Bullinger, in his Latin Bible commentaries, refers to Zwingli as the interpreter. And so he sees himself very carefully as maintaining the biblical work of Zwingli. He writes in almost all his Latin works, Zwingli is frequently quoted, much more than virtually any other source. But what's interesting is that in the public discourse, for instance, his German History of the Reformation, which he doesn't ever publish during his life. It's only published in the 19th century. But he writes this extensive history of the Reformation, very detailed. But he writes it in German. But he can't publish it during his life because it's just too controversial. So he circulates it in manuscript amongst friends. So there's kind of various levels at which this is happening. He sees himself, as he already does in 1532, saying Zwingli is the true prophet of the church, and therefore that is what I am going to be. He very clearly connects himself with Zwingli, and he sees himself as guarding the flame.
Is he a former student?
He is, yeah.
Is he just kind of a loyal patriot who's alongside?
Yeah. They first meet. He's relatively local. Comes from Bremgarten, which is not far from Zurich. He goes off to the University of Cologne. He has a kind of scholastic and then humanist education, but comes back to Zurich. He meets Zwingli in 1523, and they become friends, but not quite mentor and mentee, because Bullinger goes off to be a pastor, and then he's teaches at a Latin school which is outside of. So he develops from an early age his own theological writings, and there's actually interesting evidence that Zwingli may have been influenced by this very young man. So it's not simply going one way. But he sees himself, when he is elected Zwingli's successor after this disastrous war, he sees that the Reformation has to be founded on Zwingli's principles, but yet he will, in his own work, develop it in new directions. But for him, Zwingli was a true prophet, and by saying that, it was a true Reformation. It was what Zwingli was right. Whatever might have happened, he was right, and therefore our church is legitimate. So that connection with Zwingli was very much important about the authority of their own church. And so he starts it, but then there are various other people who are writing about him, but largely they're keeping it amongst themselves, because with the sacramental debate with the Lutherans, with Calvin's own position, and with the situation with the radicals, Zwingli's name is just too controversial to mention.
Philip Baum.
Hello.
You mentioned the name of the historian Schaff.
Philip Schaff.
Could you elaborate on his view about Zwingli as a theologian or as a political figure?
Yes. He comes from Graubünden, so the eastern part of Switzerland. He comes to America, and at Merseburg becomes one of the... He's often referred to as the father of American church history. You could debate that, but he writes this extraordinary history of Christianity from the beginning onwards. But he has a particular interest. He is himself... I believe he was a pastor, but I'm not absolute. But he's certainly Reformed. And he writes this long treatment of the Reformation and a long treatment of the Swiss Reformation, and he's quite fascinated by Zwingli. So one of the things that's interesting in Schaff's history, which is very quickly translated, was available in English and German, so it's a bestseller in the 19th century, and probably the most influential work in subsequent. But he sees in Zwingli, and he says this very explicitly, the precursor of our modern theology. He sees Zwingli, as opposed to Luther and later Calvin, as operating a much more moderate view on questions of election and others. And because of Zwingli's humanism and Zwingli's emphasis on social renewal and ethics, this kind of Erasmian direction. So he sees Zwingli as a very direct speaker to the renewal of Protestantism in the 19th century, with its emphasis on social reform and a kind of what he takes to be a kind of more liberal theological or less dogmatic theology than the later Reformed tradition. So Philip Schaff is deeply influential in shaping this notion of Zwingli as a kind of prototype, and this is what happens in the Zurich church, which divides so fiercely between conservatives and liberals, both of whom are claiming Zwingli, but this argument that runs right through Zwingli scholarship probably till Gottfried Locher in the 1950s and 60s, but this strong tradition of liberal theological interpretation of Zwingli as seen as a distinctive feature of him as opposed to Calvin and later Reformed tradition.
John Roth. I have had the opportunity to see the Zwingli film, and I thought you gave a masterful summary of it. When I saw it, I was moved by the complexity, and then at the very end of the movie, as a kind of summation about what this is about, there are words that scroll up for the viewer to see, and the words are to the effect of, Zwingli is the founder of modern religious liberty as we know it today. And I heard you also say that perhaps in the 1885 monument, there's also this sense that he is a martyr to religious liberty.
Yes.
And as someone coming out of the Anabaptist tradition, I'm just baffled by that and wonder if you could say more how that specific characteristic came to be attributed to Zwingli.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating. It's already there at the first major anniversary of Zwingli, which is in 1819. At that point, as I mentioned before, there is this debate between what are seen as the kind of Enlightenment figures of the church, and much more sort of spiritualist elements. And it has a debate that has many sides to it. But there you get Zwingli presented as this moderate Erasmian figure. Yes, exactly the question of the Anabaptists, the execution of Felix Manz in 1527, which Zwingli completely concurred with. But it's very interesting that already in these 19th century, he's seen the Anabaptists are associated with those who want to fracture the church in the 19th century, separate church and state. So he's seen in this kind of reconfiguration of his reputation as a defender of that church and state against those who have those kind of the legacy of those Anabaptist ideas of separation. So he's seen largely, as I mentioned before, theologically, but also in terms of, and you see this in the film, the emphasis on his care for the poor, the renewal of society. And that's the way he's kind of reconfigured as this ethical person who's concerned for the whole of society. And that's what makes him a sort of more sympathetic, more moderate figure. But also, I have to say, if you look at the debates in the 19th century where this emerges, and they do this with Calvin in certain circles, they do it by simply not engaging with many aspects of his theology. It's a very selective use of him. So he becomes this symbol of moderation. But you see that even in Philip Schaff. He's not debating major theological issues with this. He's creating a kind of image of Zwingli as this social reformer, this emphasis on the Christian life, the emphasis on, often comes up again and again, this idea that he has a notion of election which is far broader than the rest of this. So that's where it comes from. But part of this is that his battle with the Anabaptists is configured as the kind of defense of the Christian society and of the state church against those in the 19th century who are seen as sectarian. So they're almost reliving.
So I'm Chad Gano, and thank you for your wonderful presentation. I guess to take it further, and maybe this is more of a question for tomorrow's wrap-up, but do you think, in a sense, so we're commemorating the 500th anniversary, but at the same time, the future of the Zwinglian Reformation and Zwinglian Reformation studies are perhaps in some peril with the funding situation in an ongoing way. So, in a sense, do you see is this the end of Zwingli in a way? I mean, there's a major celebration of the 500th anniversary. Another way to think about that might be, what would and maybe for tomorrow, what is the 600th anniversary going to be, or will there even be a 600th anniversary?
Well, I won't be here for it. But I think it's very interesting. It's interesting to see what these Reformation anniversaries have done and what they have not done. I remember back in 1997, which was the anniversary of Philip Melanchthon, and there was this sense for 1 year Melanchthon was going to be allowed in Germany to have the spotlight. But then it was expected that by 1998 he would retreat back under Luther. It's a very interesting question, one that Richard would have fascinating views on. What did 2009 do for Calvin? Mm-hmm. Now, I think 2009, in some ways, did what 2017 did. Often leads to the restating of established narratives. Mm-hmm. But I think 2009, at least my experiences, has brought forward a lot of really new, interesting work on Calvin. I think that in the decades since then, we've had a lot people exploring Calvin in different ways. I think it was actually generated creativity. My hope with Zwingli is that this is not the end. I would hope rather that it would be a beginning, because my perspective is that he is a way of thinking about the complexities of the early Reformation. He's not going to overtake Calvin. We're not going to suddenly pull him out and say, this is the person we've forgotten about. But I think they continue to produce translations of his works. There's a project underway to produce his works in a new English translation. There's a project which is to try and produce some of his letters in English, which are completely inaccessible. I'm not going to look for a big renaissance, but I don't think he's going away. And in another 100 years, all I can say is that they'll be talking about, as we're doing, they'll be talking about him through the lens of their own perspectives.
Well, that's a wonderful space then to stop and thank Bruce once more for his presentation. And now please enjoy refreshments, stretch your legs, and we start up again in 15 minutes.